In the middle of a torrential downpour, a simple act of humanity unfolded, turning a mundane traffic jam into a moment of profound inspiration. One man's unexpected gesture in the rain left everyone who witnessed it speechless. The rain in Bloomington that Tuesday was relentless. It hammered against Joy Wagler's windshield, each drop a tiny percussionist in a symphony of gloom. The gray sky pressed down on the city like a heavy lid, and the streets, slick with water, reflected the blurred neon glow of storefronts in distorted patterns. The smell of wet asphalt hung heavy in the air, a damp, earthy scent that did little to lift Joy's spirits. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as the traffic crawled forward. Another delay, another setback in a day already overflowing with them. She'd spilled coffee on her favorite blouse that morning, leaving a stubborn brown stain right where everyone would see it. Her boss, usually a reasonable man, had been particularly demanding, piling on last-minute requests with an unsettling intensity. And now this, a traffic jam of epic proportions, snaking its way through the heart of the city. Joy sighed, a weary sound lost in the drumming of the rain. Her faith in humanity, always fragile, felt like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff. She was late. Terribly, unforgivably late. She was supposed to be picking up her daughter, Lily, from soccer practice, and Lily hated being kept waiting. She pictured Lily's disappointed face, her lower lip jutting out in a familiar pout, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over her. Then, through the downpour, she heard it, the faint, mournful wail of sirens in the distance. They grew louder, closer, until they seemed to vibrate right through the floor of her car. She glanced to her left and saw it. A slow-moving line of cars in the opposite lane, their headlights cutting through the gloom like beacons of sorrow. Joy frowned, momentarily distracted from her own troubles. She wondered what was going on. An accident? A parade? Probably just another inconvenience to further ruin her already terrible day. She hadn't yet connected the dots, hadn't yet realized that the source of the sirens was a funeral procession, carrying a weight of grief far heavier than her own. A truck pulled to the side of the road just ahead of her. It was an older model, a Ford F-150, its faded blue paint bearing the marks of years of hard work. A man emerged from the driver's side. He was of average height, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a sturdy, working-class build. He wore a worn, faded blue work shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned and weathered by the sun. His jeans, equally faded and worn, were tucked into a pair of scuffed work boots. Joy sighed again, louder this time. "Great," she muttered to herself. "Now someone's broken down. Just what I needed." She glanced at her watch, tapping her fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. But then, the man did something unexpected. He reached up and removed his baseball cap, revealing a close-crop head of dark hair streaked with gray. He turned to face the oncoming procession. A shiver ran down Joy's spine. A strange sense of reverence began to settle in, a feeling she hadn't anticipated. The rain intensified, as if the heavens themselves were weeping in sympathy with the mourners. The raindrops plastered the man's hair to his head, and his work shirt quickly became soaked through, clinging to his muscular frame. Joy focused on his face. It was etched with lines of weariness, but also with a surprising hint of kindness. His jaw was set, his lips pressed into a thin line. He stood ramrod straight, his head bowed slightly, his eyes fixed on the approaching cars. He looked solemn, respectful. As the first car in the procession drew near, Joy noticed the drivers in the other vehicles. Some honked impatiently, their faces contorted in expressions of annoyance. Others stared blankly, their eyes glazed over with indifference. One woman, in a sleek black SUV, even tried to cut into the procession, forcing a hearse to brake suddenly. A surge of anger rose in Joy's chest, hot and fierce. How could people be so callous, so self-absorbed? Didn't they realize what was happening? Didn't they have any respect for the dead, or for the families who were grieving? Shame washed over her, a burning tide of guilt. She had been so focused on her own petty problems, so consumed by her own self-pity, that she hadn't even considered the pain and suffering of others. She had been just as indifferent, just as selfish as those other drivers. She watched the man standing in the rain, his head bowed, his cap held respectfully in his hand. He was a stranger, a blue-collar worker she would likely never see again. But in that moment, he was a beacon of hope, a symbol of the compassion and decency that still existed in the world, even in the midst of so much darkness. The man standing in the rain wasn't just some random act of kindness. It was a debt he felt he owed. Years ago, his father, a gruff but loving man who had worked tirelessly his entire life, had passed away after a sudden heart attack. He'd been working as a long-haul trucker at the time, hundreds of miles away from home, chasing a tight deadline. The news had reached him late, and by the time he'd managed to reroute his truck and make it back, the funeral was already over. He'd missed it. He'd missed the chance to say goodbye, to pay his respects, to comfort his grieving mother and siblings. The guilt had eaten at him ever since. He'd justified it to himself at the time. The money was important, his job was crucial, his family needed him to provide. But deep down, he knew he'd made the wrong choice. He had prioritized work over family, over love, over respect. Now, whenever he saw a funeral procession, he pulled over. He took off his hat. He stood in silence, offering his own small tribute to the deceased and their loved ones. It was his way of atoning for his past mistakes, of honoring his father's memory, of reminding himself that some things in life were more important than deadlines and paychecks. As the cars crept past, he saw a young boy in the back seat of one of the vehicles, his face pressed against the window. The boy's eyes were red and swollen, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. The sight pierced the man's heart. He remembered holding his own son, just a toddler at the time of his father's death, and tried to explain to him what had happened. The boy hadn't understood, but he'd felt the weight of his father's sadness, and he'd clung to him with a desperate grip. Watching the man, Joy's mind raced. She remembered a time, years ago, when she'd been stranded on the side of the road with a flat tire. It was late at night, and she'd been terrified. A kind stranger had stopped to help her, changing the tire with a quiet efficiency and sending her on her way with a reassuring smile. She'd never forgotten that act of kindness, that small gesture of human connection that had made all the difference. But lately, she'd found herself becoming more cynical, more closed off. The pressures of work, the demands of motherhood, the constant barrage of negativity in the news, it had all taken its toll. She'd allowed herself to become hardened, to lose sight of the simple acts of compassion that made life worth living. She looked at the man again, standing in the rain, soaked to the bone but unwavering in his respect. She thought about Lily, waiting for her at soccer practice, and she felt a fresh wave of guilt. But this time, the guilt was mixed with something else, a flicker of hope, a spark of inspiration. Should she do something? Could she do something? Was it even possible to break free from her self-imposed prison of cynicism and indifference? Or was she too far gone, too jaded, too selfish to make a difference? The cars continued to pass, each one a silent reminder of the grief and sorrow that permeated the world. Joy closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision. She turned off her engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the drumming of the rain and the rumble of traffic. For a moment, she hesitated. What would people think? Would they laugh at her? Would they think she was crazy? She glanced at her watch. Lily was probably frantic by now. But then, she remembered the man's face, his quiet dignity, his unwavering respect. She remembered the boy in the back seat, his tear-stained cheeks, and she knew what she had to do. She opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. The cold water instantly soaked through her clothes, sending a shiver down her spine. She hadn't brought an umbrella, and her hair was plastered to her face within seconds. She walked slowly towards the side of the road, keeping her eyes fixed on the funeral procession. She stood a few feet away from the man, giving him his space. She didn't say anything, didn't make eye contact. She simply stood there, facing the cars, her head bowed slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. A shared moment of silence, a shared moment of respect. They were two strangers, united by a common humanity, bound together by a silent act of compassion. Joy could feel the man's presence beside her, a sense of quiet strength and solidarity. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime and cynicism that had accumulated over the years. As the last car in the procession passed, the man turned to her. He didn't smile, but his eyes crinkled at the corners, and he gave her a subtle nod of the head. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. "You're welcome," Joy replied, her voice choked with emotion. The procession was over. The road began to clear. The pressure on Joy's chest began to ease. The rain, as if sensing the shift in mood, began to subside. She looked at the man again, really looked at him. He was just an ordinary person, an average Joe, a working-class hero. But at that moment, he was the most extraordinary person she had ever met. He had reminded her of the power of compassion, of the importance of respect, of the beauty of human connection. Back in her car, Joy's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. She quickly texted Lily, apologizing for being late and promising to be there as soon as possible. Then, she opened her social media app and began to type. She didn't know what to say, how to capture the essence of what she had just experienced. But she knew she had to share the story, to spread the message of kindness and compassion. "I was stuck in traffic today," she wrote, "when I saw something truly remarkable. A man pulled over to the side of the road and stood in the pouring rain to pay his respects to a funeral procession. He didn't know anyone in those cars, but he stood there anyway, soaked to the bone, honoring the deceased and their loved ones." She hesitated, unsure whether to include a photo, but then she decided against it. She didn't want to exploit the man's act of kindness, to turn it into some kind of spectacle. She wanted to protect his privacy, to honor his anonymity. "I don't know him," she continued, "but he's a wonderful example of how we should all act. In a world that often feels cold and uncaring, he reminded me that there is still goodness and compassion out there. He reminded me that even the smallest acts of kindness can make a difference." She posted the message and closed the app, feeling a sense of peace and contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. Within minutes, the story began to spread. People shared it, commented on it, liked it. They shared their own stories of kindness and compassion, of strangers who had gone out of their way to help them in times of need. The post went viral, reaching people all over the world. A few weeks later, Joy was at her local coffee shop when she saw him. He was sitting at a table by the window, reading a newspaper. He looked up as she walked past, and his eyes met hers. He recognized her instantly. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience. They didn't say anything, didn't exchange any words. But in that moment, they understood each other perfectly. They were two strangers connected by a single act of kindness, bound together by a shared belief in the power of compassion. The rain had stopped completely, and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the city with a golden glow. Joy smiled, feeling a renewed sense of hope and optimism. The world wasn't perfect, but it was still a beautiful place, filled with moments of kindness and compassion, just waiting to be discovered. And it all started with a man standing in the rain. The story illustrates the profound impact of simple acts of compassion and respect. Even in our fast-paced, often self-absorbed world, taking a moment to acknowledge the suffering of others can have a ripple effect, inspiring kindness and empathy in those around us. It serves as a reminder that we all have the power to make a positive difference, no matter how small our actions may seem. The narrative champions the enduring strength of human connection and the importance of remembering our shared humanity. It underscores that even in the face of adversity and loss, kindness and empathy can provide comfort, hope, and a renewed sense of faith in the goodness of others. By embracing compassion and extending a helping hand, we can create a more compassionate and understanding world.